Assalamu alaikum. My name is Nimat Kabutli.
And I'm Fida Abdo. Welcome to the On Purpose podcast.
This podcast addresses pertinent issues that affect Muslim communities in Australia.
We hope that this is the beginning of many conversations.
Enjoy this episode.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to today's episode of MWA's On Purpose podcast. Today, we are blessed to have with us Lydia Shelly. Thank you, Lydia, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. So, Lydia today is with us to talk about the well-being of children amidst separation, divorce, family disharmony, and how we prioritise the best interests of the child. So Lydia is a solicitor with the Supreme Court of New South Wales and the High Court of Australia. She's highly experienced in criminal, family, wills and estate matters, has presented evidence at several Australian parliamentary inquiries, regularly provides media commentary both within Australia and internationally, and is also the co-vice president of the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties and serves on a number of not-for-profit boards. So thank you again, Lydia, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for opening up the conversation about this really important issue. I don't think it gets the attention that it needs, especially within the Muslim community.
Yeah, it doesn't, and it can be a bit confusing sometimes for people as well. So we might start with, looking at your experience with family law matters over, so many years. What do you find to be the biggest difficulties that families going through conflict, separation, divorce, what are the biggest difficulties that they face when they're navigating the legal system here?
That's a really good question. How much time do we have? I think one of the most interesting things about this particular area of law, family law, and helping families navigate through that system, which can be incredibly bewildering and confusing, is that there's often a disconnect between the legal processes and the law and the emotional responses and the trauma of a separation, of a family breakup, so to speak, of the client. And so often lawyers will approach the family or the client and we'll talk almost parallel. We don't often meet. But one of the biggest difficulties I think that any parent faces when they're going through a separation and they need to resolve their matters, like in a formal setting like court, is that they often can't prioritise the needs of the children, and they can't see past their own needs or their own hurt, their own frustration or anger or trauma, particularly if that parent has experienced physical or family violence. So that's probably the biggest issue that I see parents facing when they're trying to navigate the family law system.
Okay, so looking at that, and when a family is going through having to separate, what are the types of services that family lawyers can actually do to assist families going through this whole process?
That is a great question. Now, there are a lot of services out there. I think the difficulty for clients, let alone practitioners, is that we often work in silos, particularly when we're dealing with a client from a cultural religious background of which isn't our own. We have to be very careful that we engage with third parties and services that aren't going to cause the client further harm. So there are third-party professionals that we often work with. That's psychologists, including child psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health support teams, family violence specialists, including specialists who can go in and actually safety plan and do risk assessments and to manage your client actually leaving a physically abusive or coercive and controlling any element of family violence relationship. Often clients come to lawyers first and they say, look, this is what's happening, and they disclose family violence. If you're able at that point to be informed enough to go, this needs to have a risk assessment taken in terms of how you're going to leave this relationship safely, you can save your client a wealth of harm and those children a wealth of harm as well. So we have to be informed in regards to mental health, family violence and other risk issues, because unfortunately they're very prevalent in family law matters. And those other risk issues might include, for example, criminal associations, it could include drug use, addiction issues and things like that.
So you mentioned all of these things, right? Sometimes it can be very overwhelming for someone going through, this whole process for them. So if they were to seek the support of a family lawyer, would that family lawyer be able to take care of all of these things and these referral pathways, or, what would that process look like?
This is the other issue, is that your experience of the family law system and your experience of separation and your experience in grounding the next phase of your parenting with the other parent varies very differently and is wildly different depending on the type of family lawyer that you engage. And it is not one standard across the board in terms of the access to third-party referrals and support services. In a perfect world, it would be. There'd be a benchmark, but there simply isn't. It's not legislated. I don't have to, as a family lawyer, refer my client off to anyone unless it's ordered by the court, or unless I see a deficiency in my client's case and I say, look, we need a report to, set something out that's in dispute. But other than that, there's no obligation on family lawyers to do any of those things, even in the context of family violence, which I find extraordinary.
That really is.
It is.
That really is. Because when you're going through this trauma, you just want someone to take care of it for you, right? Yeah, so,
absolutely.
Help me through it, help me navigate these processes, help me find what is the best thing and option for me to be able to do, right? So in understanding how to choose a family lawyer, what are people actually looking for?
Well, look, I think it's important to go to somebody that's experienced, that knows what they're doing. I think it's also important to understand that not every family law separation or dispute needs to go to court. Ultimately, I would like to think that people are wanting to resolve their matters when they can be resolved. Sometimes you have to go to court. Sometimes there's a risk issue, like, for example, mental health that impacts the other parent's capacity to parent and to keep the children safe, and you need to go to court because there's that type of dispute that needs to be decided and determined by a judicial officer. But for people who don't need to go to court, their lawyer should not be charging off to the court and filing applications that don't need to be filed. Because when we file an application at the court, I have to get my client to essentially prepare an affidavit with me. The affidavit is inevitably going to criticise the other parent or set out what they believe are the risk issues with the other parent's household. Now imagine getting that affidavit out of the blue and reading all those terrible things that the other parent has said about you, even if they're true. It's incredibly confronting. And at times, as lawyers, I feel like we have to be very careful about the types of things and how they're worded. Not everything that clients tell lawyers need to go into an affidavit. We have to be very careful that only the relevant information that's going to cause the least harm, while still meeting our obligations to our clients and to the court and to the children ultimately, are set out in that affidavit. But it can be very confronting when you get that document, I can tell you.
It can, and this is probably one of the barriers, right, that people from within the Muslim community or people from culturally, linguistically, religiously diverse backgrounds face when it comes to seeking a lawyer for their family law matters.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to highlight that, particularly for Muslim women, often they don't want a lawyer from the community. And I think that we have to also appreciate that they have the agency to determine who they want to represent their interests and their children's interests. In saying that, there are often some really important cultural and spiritual and religious practices, other than Eid and Ramadan, that provide an explanation for really significant things the court may need to consider when it comes to the children. But for me also, there are little nuances and different ways that family violence manifests itself depending on the client's cultural and religious background.
Okay, can you elaborate a bit on that?
So, for example, in my experience, and I've been doing this for over God knows how long, it can be really confronting, even as a practitioner, and quite frustrating, can I say, when somebody who is a lawyer from outside the Muslim community is representing a Muslim client on the other side, and they, for example, try and characterise normal everyday Muslim practices as being a form of extremism, for example. So they take out of context the whole spiritual connection with respect to practice of faith and try and make it something that it's not. That can be frustrating and bewildering for the client. The other aspect to that as well is that often, especially when we come to talking about coercive and controlling family violence issues, that can be totally missed if you're not from the same cultural or religious background.
I think that's a really important thing. Can you explain a little bit, because people, especially this term coercive control, it's been you know, quite prominent lately. From a legal perspective at the moment, what is it?
I'll put it in the best way that I can for people at home to understand, rather than talk about the legal mumbo jumbo that we like to engage in as lawyers. Effectively, if you're feeling like you're constantly on eggshells, or you're feeling like unless you do what that other person is asking you to do, something bad will happen, that can be considered coercive and controlling behaviour. I'm being made to feel like I need to do something and I don't want to do it, but I'm worried about the consequences. And everyone, I think, has had, most of us, I think, have had that feeling of walking on eggshells for whatever reason. As a kid, we might have experienced it. As an adult, we might have experienced it at home, in the workplace, at school, wherever. It's that type of feeling, that overriding feeling that you have. Now, homes should be safe places for everybody, including children. So when we have that predominant feeling resting within us for a long time, that's a concern. That's a concern. So if you're feeling compelled or forced to do something against your will, chances are you might need to seek some advice and some further information about whether or not that's coercive and controlling behaviour.
Okay, so what would be then the cultural, religious or spiritual considerations in regards to coercive control, not just about, you know, men to women, but also with children as well?
That's a really good question. So the ones that I've seen in my experience, and even most recently, is this issue of, for example, disguising coercive and controlling behaviour as fitting in within the religious obligation. So, for example, if somebody's feeling forced to wear something or to go somewhere or to do something, and the other person's saying, you need to do it, otherwise you're a bad Muslim, you know, the angels are going to curse you at night unless you submit to me, all these types of things. In my view, that is not a religious advice that's being issued to you. That is ultimately a form of coercive and controlling behaviour. For me, as a Muslim woman, what is most insidious about that aspect of coercive and controlling behaviour is that you are causing obvious harm, but you are causing spiritual harm. And I would hate to stand before God on the day of judgment if you're perpetrating this type of harm, because I think it's a very serious form of spiritual harm. But it's a form of harm that you really need to articulate really well before the court, because it's not a common form of coercive and controlling behaviour that they ordinarily see. Yeah. Because it's actually really hard to articulate it. Yeah. Because often clients, when they come to you, you know, in law school we get taught, client will come and see you. You will take initial instructions. They will tell you everything about the nature of the relationship since the time they met until the time they separated. That's not how trauma affects our memory. No, not at all. Clients find it incredibly difficult to recount really personal forms of family violence that they've experienced, or they find it really difficult to tell you because they feel guilty that they weren't able to protect children from that environment.
And that sort of coercive controlling behaviour is really contrary to our Islamic teachings, the examples that we have. When we talk about, everyone loves saying, the root word of Islam is salam, which is peace. Well, what role does that play in the family?
Well, any family, it should play a very important role. But I just think I've seen so many parents, unfortunately, and children whose relationship with God has changed as a result of the experiences of their Muslim partner. And it's not just, I'm not just talking about women, I'm also talking about men as well. So that for me is something that a lot of family lawyers probably wouldn't pick up on unless they were from the same cultural or religious background, is how do you protect a client from spiritual harm? It's a really difficult question. So when we talk about going back a bit in terms of the services, if I have a client that I know would benefit, for example, from sisterhood or brotherhood or from being around like-minded people of the same faith and same beliefs, then I will make that referral.
Yeah. So if we sort of hone in now on the well-being of children, right? The best interest. This is something, the best interest of the child is always mentioned.
Absolutely.
What does that mean?
What does it all mean? Other than being the overriding principle, one of the overriding principles in the family law jurisdiction, what I want everyone to understand is that you do not have a right to spend any time with your children. Whether you're the mother or the father, you do not have a right to have the children live with you. When we talk about family law, it's really about what are the children's rights. Yeah. And when we talk about best interests, this is what this means. It means that the children are considered to have a relationship with both parents. That's in their best interests. Unless that relationship with one of the parents, or sadly sometimes both parents, can't be managed safely.
So what does that mean, managed safely? Because people, there are legal, opinions and rulings, but then everyone has their own personal opinion.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The court, and that's why it's so important to get advice on this issue, right? Because you might be saying, look, I don't like the way that they parent in their household. And that's so common.
It's very
when there's
common.
Two different households, I might have a different way of doing things. The other parent might have a different way of doing things. But does that make it wrong, and does that make it a risk? 9 times out of 10, it actually isn't a risk. When we talk about risk, is there a significant mental health issue? And I want to make this really clear. Having a mental health issue doesn't disqualify you from living with a child and spending time with a child. There is no presumption that having a mental health condition means you're an unfit, and we don't use those terms in the jurisdiction, but unfit parent. There is no presumption. And often people come to me thinking incorrectly that there is that presumption. And so they don't want to tell you if they're struggling, or they don't want to tell you that they were diagnosed with postnatal depression, or they don't want to tell you that they're suffering from anxiety, right? Which is so common, so common. Mental health is such a prevalent issue in our communities.
Yeah. Well, I think because, that touches on the issue of stigma, right?
Yes.
So already the fact that someone is going through the process of divorce, their family broke down, they couldn't bring it together. Often, that'll fall on the shoulder, that responsibility or the reasons for it may fall on the shoulders of the woman, right? Very often, why didn't she make it work, right? Or
what's wrong with her?
Exactly. And the other thing is, we're going to stay together because we want to do it for the children.
Absolutely.
In the best interest of the children.
Yeah.
Why is that not something to do, to stay together when there is risk issues, it's unsafe, there is any forms of domestic violence, but staying together for the sake of the children? Why is that not better for the children?
Oh, that's a really great question, because certainly the way that I was raised with my parents, they're still together and whatnot, but there was that overriding. I remember having a really good friend at school, and my mum said to me, "Oh, but she's from a broken home." And I said, "What's happened to a house? I thought a roof had caved in. I thought it was a physically broken house." Yeah. And I said, "What's that?" She said, "Oh, the parents aren't together anymore." Now that type of view is hopefully changing. My mum's an old lady now, as am I. But in any event, research tells us it is without a doubt that children who are exposed to high conflict, they are harmed in the process of that exposure. Now, when we talk, you asked a really good question earlier with respect to when we talk about risk, what does it mean in relation to children's best interests? What it means is that if you have a risk issue in your household, or there's a risk issue with respect to how you parent, right? And you don't seek any help to improve upon that situation or that condition, then it's going to be unsafe for your child to either live with you or spend time with you on an unsupervised basis. Yeah. There are lots of things we can do as lawyers to say, look, the child has to have a relationship with mum or dad because they have a good relationship. It's only when, for example, one of the parents isn't compliant with a treatment plan, or when they relapse with respect to an addiction issue, or things like that, we can actually put in orders that make it safe for the child to have a relationship with the other parent, but that takes into account those risk issues. Now, we can't do that with every single risk issue, and every single family out there is different in terms of how it deals with these situations and what the actual risk issues are. But what I can say is that if you have a risk issue in your household and you're thinking, oh, look, it's best for the children to stay together because I don't want people to talk. I don't want people to know they're from a broken home. That you need to be completely honest with yourself and understand that you're harming the children indirectly. And this is unfortunate because everybody has agency and everyone can make big adult decisions about whether or not they choose to stay in a relationship, for example, that might have family violence characterised within it. The difficulty is that children don't have the power to make those choices. And can I say that there's often a nexus, that is, there's family law often meets child protection and they come together. Because if parents, whether it's mum or dad, are failing to protect children from being exposed to family violence, then if the agencies become aware of that and they know that that child is experiencing harm, they will take action to potentially provide scaffolding for the family, that is, refer the parents off to other services, counselling, behavioural change courses for perpetrators and things like that. Or they'll remove the children.
Yeah, well, what you just said, that's another huge fear.
Absolutely.
That fear of if I divulge that I'm in an unsafe situation at home, then someone will take my kids from me.
Yeah.
If someone comes to you with that dilemma, what do you say to them?
And this is why it's so important that I don't wear every single hat. And by that I mean it is not appropriate for me to perform a safety or risk assessment for that client, and that's why I work with other people who can do that. Because often what the research tells us is primarily with women, they are at the most risky point of harm and physical violence when they ultimately leave that relationship. So leaving that relationship has to be managed very carefully and very safely. And that's why we seek professional support as lawyers in how to help that client, how to put all the jigsaw puzzle pieces together to make it a safe exit for that parent and for the children. It's not an automatic thing that your children are going to be removed if you're experiencing family violence. That would be a horrific outcome in Australia if you disclose family violence and then as a result your children are removed. It's only if you continue to stay there and you refuse the advice and assistance from, for example, DCJ, or people might know them as FACS or DOCS, if they refuse to accept assistance in that regard. So it's not just the fact that you've experienced it, it's what you do thereafter. What's your accountability?
And ultimately, for a parent, I mean, parenting by itself is difficult enough.
Oh, it's so hard.
It's so difficult, and there are so many issues that you probably never imagine you're going to face, and you have to face.
Absolutely.
When then you're faced with, so if a woman then leaves her husband and then he's got his own ways of parenting, right? And her concern is, well, if I was to do that, how are we even supposed to raise healthy, well-educated, well-rounded children? So, no, I will stay. Yeah. And it will be all right because at least we're all together and I still have some form of control.
Yeah, and this is so common. Can I say that this is really common? Your children are not deficient if they live or spend time in two different households. They are not deficient in any way if they have 2, 4 different parents. You know, I'm lucky that my everybody pretty much in the Muslim community in Sydney at least knows that I'm separated. I get on very well with my children's father. He's a really good dad, really good dad. Now, did I feel that way towards him when we first separated? If you had asked me back then, probably not. Probably not. I have to accept, like he has to accept, we do things very differently. But do you know what ties us together in terms of our parenting? Is that we're child-focused. Yeah. And at the start, can I say that sometimes that was really difficult from a personal point of view. So I get it. I get it when a client comes to me and says, oh, you know, he doesn't return the school shoes on time. Yeah. For example, oh, he doesn't feed the kids a good breakfast. What do they eat? Oh, they eat, you know, whatever. We don't eat that in our household. You've got to, when you separate, appreciate that there's a level of control of which you have to release. Yeah. You don't have control. Yeah. And you have to have, and this is the huge part where legal advice isn't going to solve, by the way, you have to have faith that if the other parent has your children's well-being at heart, They might do things differently, but if the intention's there, 9 times out of 10, they'll be okay. Your children are going to be okay. Children are resilient, but you have to have open lines of communication. And sometimes, can I say, very hard, especially when you've just separated. You have community pressure, you have family pressure, you have the spiritual or religious pressure on you in terms of what decisions should you make. Oh, he said this. Oh, I can't believe it. You need to do that. Don't let him see the children. He can't speak to you that way, blah, blah, blah. Overwhelming at the start.
Yes.
Everything is so raw. And then you add into the mix that you might not be engaged with specialist support services. You might not, for example, be getting counselling to help you with your anxiety about having to say goodbye to your children at changeover and crying and getting upset, and then the children taking on that emotional burden, which isn't theirs to carry. All they know is they're going to dad's house and they're going to have a great weekend.
That's right. And you used a term here, being child-focused, right? And I think everyone likes to think they are child-focused, but there are other things that come into play.
Sure.
So when do you and how do you talk about family separating, the conflict, the divorce with the children?
Yeah, this is a hard one. Can I say that I think that I actually feel quite blessed in a weird way, and some people might go, how can she say this? That I've personally been through that process of separation and divorce in the Muslim context. Yep. And I think as a revert, though, it's manifested a bit differently for me. And so although I understand when clients of the same faith background come to me for advice, and I understand those little intricacies and nuances, I think also being a revert has other issues that arise. And I didn't appreciate that until I went through this experience. So I think my own personal experience has made me actually a better informed lawyer when it comes to practicing this jurisdiction. When we talk about child focus, though, from experience, I can tell you, I know all the research, I can cite all the case law, but you're quite right. We get distracted as parents, and often it can be difficult. Even if parents out there have the best intentions, it can be difficult at times to separate your needs or your wants from your child's needs, because often they clash.
That's right. They do.
Right? But we've got to be the better person, because if we consistently, we're allowed to slip every now and again, but if we consistently don't reflect and we consistently don't try and strengthen our co-parenting skills, because it is a skill to co-parent. It doesn't come naturally. It really doesn't. When we talk about issues of control and things like that, it's hard. You have to unlearn a lot of your belief systems around what it is to parent when you separate. It can be really difficult. And I'm talking from a professional point of view and a personal point of view.
So how do we then directly talk with children in a way that has their best interests at heart? Because, obviously what many fall into is, the mother saying, your dad is this, your dad is that, to the children, the father saying the same thing, right? Yeah. So how do we keep that best interest of the child, but then also being honest? You don't want to, pretend or lie.
Absolutely.
Right? So what does that balance look like?
It depends ultimately on the age of the children, the maturity of the children. What I can say is that what is really unfortunate is when one parent takes it upon themselves to tell the children not a child-focused explanation as to why mum has to move out or dad has to move out. Your dad was doing 1, 2, 3. Your mum was 1, 2, 3. I want people to understand, when they denigrate the other parent, that is when you badmouth them, say bad things about the other parent, who do they think their children are made up of? Their children, my kids, are half me and half their dad. So when I'm speaking badly about their father, what my child is understanding is that mum is talking that way about me. That's how kids operate. That's what research tells us, right? So not only am I talking spiritual mumbo jumbo in terms of this is how kids feel and whatnot, this is backed up by science. Yeah. So when you denigrate, when you say things like, your mum is not a good woman, I've sent her back, I've sent her to her family, to whoever. Yeah. Or your father did 1, 2, 3. He was seeing other people. That is hurting your children. Yeah. There needs to be an agreement, and I always write off to the other side or to the other parent directly and say we need to have an agreement about how the children are going to be told. Yeah. Often I'll refer off to a psychologist, a child psychologist, because what's so important is that children do not take on the blame, or they don't feel responsible, because it's not their emotional burden to carry.
Not at all.
It's not their responsibility, but they often feel that. Even in amicable separations, children will feel like it's their fault. And that's a totally normal emotional response. It's normal.
Yeah.
Expect it. Expect for that to happen. But you need to explain it in a way that honours the child's maturity and their age. What I say to a 2-year-old is going to be wildly different to what I tell my 15-year-old. But what's important, stay child-focused. Do not denigrate the other parent. Don't denigrate them. You're harming, even if you want to, even if it's right at the tip of your tongue, even if you feel you are justified and have a reason to do it. Understand, as soon as those words leave your mouth, you've indirectly harmed your child.
So what advice would you give to a newly divorced woman who has to address the situation with her children?
Get advice, get support. Do not take advice ultimately and solely from family, from community, or from religious institutions or figures. You can, of course, consult them for advice, but it's like, imagine a jigsaw puzzle. You consider this part of the advice, you consider that part of the advice, you put it all together. But ultimately, the advice that you need to really take to heart needs to take into account what your child's needs are now and what they will be in the future. And that can be really difficult. Also, what are your needs now and what are your needs going to be in the future? One step further, are you prepared to do the hard work to get from point A to point B? So your needs now might be housing, financial, parenting skills. You might need to brush up on parenting skills. How do you co-parent with someone you might not even like or respect? How do you do that? So you need help to get to point A to point B.
Is there value? I mean, as human beings, we tend to always be in a rush to move to the next part of our lives. Like when we know that, okay, that's done. So now I have to have this all sorted out. So if I've separated, now I need to know exactly what I'm doing, what my ex-partner is doing, where my kids are, what's happening. I've got to sort out the whole co-parenting.
Yeah.
Is there value in stopping and pausing for a moment?
Absolutely, and we very rarely do that. You're quite right, in our lives, let alone when we're trying to establish or run an effective co-parenting relationship with the other parent. Absolutely, it's important. I've made mistakes as a parent. Absolutely, I've said, their dad might be running late to changeover or pick them up, and I'll be like, I might say something, might just slip out. Everyone does it, but that issue about stop, reflect. Are you consistent in trying to better yourself, better your parenting? And it's doing a parenting program or seeking professional support isn't a failing. We often say, I'd do anything for my kids. I would die for my kids. But when I say to parents, okay, you say that, but you won't go and do a 6-week course that's going to give you the skills to better navigate, for example, when a conflict arises with the other parent. How are you going to negotiate that? How are you going to resolve it? We need to get taught these skills because your co-parenting relationship after separation, wildly different to when you were parenting under the same household or when that family structure was intact.
Okay, so in regards to parents who now are becoming co-parents, right, and each of them understanding best interests of the child, how are they able to ensure that they are supported, right, themselves, while they're co-parenting, especially if interactions with their ex-partner trigger them? How are they supposed to go about that?
This is a really common experience, particularly for women who have separated, because they, like I said, might fundamentally dislike the other parent because of the experiences they had when they were with that other parent, when they were with their partner. And it might be really difficult for them to accept, although they were a terrible partner, they actually might be a really good dad. And that in and of itself is often really difficult for people to come to terms with. The other thing that you hit the nail on the head in terms of insight, we have to have insight as humans, as Muslims, but also in terms of parents, we have to have insight. I've had to apologise to my children, for example, for something I've said or did or whatnot, I've said, oh, look, sorry, I said it and I shouldn't have. You know, you're allowed to say sorry as a parent. You're allowed to demonstrate insight. You're allowed to demonstrate being kind to not only your children but to yourself, and to recognise when you need assistance and to try better. That's all we ask for, is to try better.
So when you were saying this, something occurred to me. You know, we spoke about parenting being difficult, but with community pressure from family, sometimes people feel that they have to remain strong, right? They have to show that, because you said it's okay to say sorry. That is very difficult for many people to do, to apologise to their child, because there's this perception which is not founded in our Islamic teachings nor in our current society, but that parent is here and child is here, right? And this, really connects with the concept of what is a family? What does a family look like?
Yeah, absolutely.
And feeling bad because I have broken up my family, right? And then so many people will put on this facade of, okay, I'm strong, I am in control, I know what I'm doing, I can't show any weakness, I can't show any vulnerability.
Because that's our safety net.
Of course it is. And so we cannot then say to our child, I'm sorry, I made a mistake.
Yeah, because it's hard to be vulnerable.
Yes.
It's very hard.
So through your experience, both professionally and through, just community, all that, the work that you do, what value is there in demonstrating your vulnerabilities to your child?
I can't stress this enough. It's taken me a really long time, I think, and I think this is something that comes with maturity, to feel comfortable being vulnerable. Now, it's not every situation that I'm comfortable being vulnerable. I have to feel that I'm safe in terms of feeling like I'm vulnerable. But it's something that we often don't let ourselves feel because it's uncomfortable. And it's horrifying, and we think, oh, but what if this happens? If I disclose something, if I cry in front of someone, or if I admit I'm not doing well or whatnot, what are the consequences going to be? Which is really interesting, because my understanding as a Muslim is that we often have to surrender, right?
Yeah.
We often have to disclose. We often have to admit that we're failing. We often have to admit that, we're not worthy of God's forgiveness and mercy and things like that, but he gives it to us anyway.
Yeah.
So it's often this disconnect as Muslims, I think, in experiencing that issue of vulnerability, which is really interesting. Again, it's that disconnect, or maybe we don't slow down to reflect on that.
It is. And I think part of one's identity is a Muslim, because being a Muslim can take so many different forms, right? Yeah. So there's not just one way. This is how you are a Muslim man. This is how you are a Muslim woman. This is how you are a Muslim child. This is what Muslim family looks like. There's no definition. There's no picture that tells us how to do that.
Absolutely.
Right? But there are principles. And we also know as Muslims there are principles just in our spiritual connection with God, And maybe you've touched on this, being this disconnect from, okay, we look at our worship as one thing, but then our being a parent as another, or, being another person interacting here is something separate. But when bringing these together and really looking to our faith, it can actually strengthen our connection with our children, Absolutely. Our connection with our partner, our connection with our ex-partner as well, for a greater purpose.
Not only with our ex-partner, but perhaps with our partner's new partner. Yeah. So I'm very fortunate, for example, that my boy's bonus mum, as we like to call her, and the boys have a bonus dad on my side too. But so essentially that's 4 parents. So when we talk about who is in our family and what that looks like, we have to also remain open that God is going to send us people in our children's lives that we will have to have a relationship with, and that we all have to be on the same page in terms of what being child-focused looks like in each household, because it can look different, and that's okay. There is sometimes more than one way to be child-focused. Totally okay. It doesn't mean that the other parent's wrong or that you're wrong and the other parent's right. But in managing those relationships, it can take a while to find your rhythm, and that's also okay. And you can admit to your children, again, depending on the age and the maturity, and you don't need to go into all the ins and outs in terms of adult issues, because that wouldn't be appropriate. Kids don't need to know that. But I think there's a lot of strength in seeing your children try, and to seeing your children, they innately understand when something is difficult for a parent. They are, especially their relationship with their mothers when they're very young, they're in tune. You think about when a baby, you try and sneak up in the morning before they wake up and they know that you're not there if you're sleeping beside them, or they can almost feel you stirring in the house.
Yeah.
And they wake up, subhanAllah.
Yeah.
They have that connection. That connection to the parent continues. It doesn't really matter how old they are. So I think all of these issues are often forgotten because law is often a very black and white jurisdiction. Sometimes there is no room for shades of religion or faith or spirituality, or what does a future co-parent look like, or what's my mental health like, what's the other side's mental health, what is my children's current mental health status, what do we need to do to support that, do we need to have further interventions other than just spiritual support.
So then that brings us to one of our, the main issue here is not all solutions are solely religious solutions.
Correct.
Right? Because when you're going through this within the community, they're like, okay, go speak to the sheikh.
Yeah.
As if the sheikh is going to solve
Yeah.
all of your problems, right? As a community and understanding divorced families, right? How can we as a community be more inclusive of divorced families?
That's a great question because there's so many different layers to that. I mean, when we talk about Muslim communities, we're also having to consider who are consulting governments in relation to experiences of separated parents, who are consulting, who are the bodies consulting, for example, with the family courts jurisdiction and the Law Society. What does that engagement look like fundamentally? So we have all these different layers of consultation, engagement, and support for separated families. So the separated families and their experiences obviously is going to be coloured by their socioeconomic background, their access to justice and education about the family law process very early on, the age of their children, their cultural background, how they practice their faith, because although we're all Muslim, there are very different ways that we practice and we consider important religious principles and how they manifest. So all these things, my point is that there's not one homogenous, that is, there's no one standard lock, stock and barrel experience of separation and divorce. And we need to, as Muslims in the community, understand that. We also need to be very mindful, and this is the big one, is that when our best friend or our sister or our brother is speaking badly about the other parent in front of the children, even if you think they're justified, you need to shut it down. Similar to when there was a really big push years ago about if you're a bystander to family violence, what to do. If your mate down at the pub or, down at the mosque in our case, says something inappropriate or misogynistic or sexist or makes a terrible comment about a woman's appearance, what's your role as the bystander? I like to think that there needs to be a push in this situation to pull up your friend or your family member when they're denigrating the parent to the other children, or they're deliberately inflaming a situation because they can't see past their own nafs. They can't see past their own ego, their own needs, their own wants. Sometimes something the other parent will do will really annoy the hell out of you, if I can say that.
Yeah.
But you have to think, is it worth it? Is it worth it? Is what I'm getting upset about, why is it triggering me so much?
Yeah. And importantly, if it is, what support are you seeking in order to deal with it?
That's right. And that's the big one.
Yeah. That it doesn't need to be like that. You don't need to feel this way every time something happens, right?
Correct. And it's not good for your children because they will pick up on it. And your parenting in your household is ultimately affected by if you're triggered by that incident or that relationship that you have to have with the other parent. So often that is quite a normal thing for somebody to have to seek professional support to work through. Yeah. Because it's hard. It is hard work. But can I say that there is enormous benefit for your children and for you personally if you lay the groundwork and you do the hard work to establish a really rock-solid foundation for a co-parenting relationship after you separate. But it's not easy. Don't expect it to be, rainbows and lollipops because it's not.
Yeah. I think there's just one final issue that's important to for women in particular who go through separation is dealing with the shame, the stigma, the blame that's associated with it. It can really take its toll. What would be your, suggestions, advice for dealing with that when it's coming from the most beloved to you, your family, your closest friends perhaps, and, not finding that immediate circle that you can connect with anymore?
As Muslim women, we fundamentally have to have the belief in layperson speak, God will always have your back. He will not desert you. He has never deserted you, and he's not going to do that now. You need to have that faith. In saying that, if you are unable to advocate for yourself, for example, against your family and saying, Mum, I don't like when you say that, and you challenge them, then you need to seek support services that can do that for you. So sometimes, and I've lived through this experience, when you separate, sometimes your friendship circles change, your access to spiritual support changes, your standing in the community. For example, I think for reverts, and this was something really unexpected for me, is that I felt that my visibility, somehow that my recognition of being a Muslim woman was dependent upon me being partnered with my partner. And I hadn't expected that challenge to that part of my identity. And that's all fine and well and good. It's all resolved itself now. But at that immediate aftermath, that was like, whoa, I did not expect that. So for women, I think they're in a very different place to men when we go through a divorce. For women, we're still considered that there must be something wrong with us if we get divorced. And it's interesting because that's clearly not the case when we look at Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his relationships that he had with other women and with his wives, in terms of some of them were divorced and whatnot. So I just think there's this really, again, this interesting disconnect between what we know as our legacy as Muslims and our history and what our relationships with each other and our God looks like, compared to sometimes what we mirror back or what we adhere to. That's right. And our legacy as Muslims is, when it comes to women and taking care of women, that is like very, very high on the priority list as a community. Yes. Right? As a whole community. And there is no distinction in terms of status if someone is single, married or divorced. But I feel like especially in the last 10, 15 years, we've had amazing campaigns and workshops and education predominantly attended by women. Yeah. Why is that? Well, I don't know. I don't know where the men are, but it would be really great to see some male faces there. And this isn't a criticism, hashtag not all men, not. But I think there needs to be, my point is in saying that, is that there needs to be a more holistic approach between both male and female community members and our leadership in addressing this issue of stigma and what it means. Because it's a hollow belief structure. The stigma that's attached to Muslim women after they are divorced, whether or not they initiate it, has no grounding in reality. Now, I'm not taking away from the experiences of Muslim women. Absolutely, I'm not. My point is that when we believe in it, or when we project that stigma, or when we engage in perpetrating that stigma even further, what we're doing is it's a hollow belief structure. There is nothing behind it. Like you said, there is nothing in our religion that essentially decreases the value of a woman if they separate from their partner. Yeah, according to her marital status. It is not anything that should be defining your status as a person, right? It affects your identity in other ways, but often it's those external forces that impact you. And your spiritual worth, as a Muslim woman who should worship our Creator, doesn't decrease depending on your marital status. And I want to make that really clear, because I think we often overlook the spiritual impact of a divorce or a separation. Now, when I talk about divorce, I'm talking about both Islamic divorce and the civil divorce. Either way, they can have a tremendous impact on the woman's faith, her identity within the faith, but ultimately her relationship with God. So as Muslims, we also, especially if we're in positions of leadership, or we're in positions where we have influence over this sphere or access to clients who are going through this process. We have to also be very mindful about what spiritual supports we build in for that person, because that is an overlooked aspect, I think, of separation. But in saying that, without a doubt, Islamic divorces and the withholding about Islamic divorces, and I don't care, quite frankly, what any other organisation or institution tells me to the contrary, because I have seen this for so many years, and it is a reoccurring issue, is that Islamic divorces being provided to women is still weaponised in our communities, and it is still being used as potential leverage over the Muslim woman, and it's been seen as a bargaining tool and as a form of punishment as a result of either leaving or separating or breaking up the family home, so to speak. And that is something that we really need our Muslim brothers to advocate against. Again, and I'm not talking about just the people in leadership positions. I'm talking about if you're a brother out there and you have another brother, a friend or a physical blood brother who is doing this, please pull him up on it. If you're a sheikh that is listening, please do better, please, because we need you to do better. It's not grounded in faith, and it's actually very harmful. And this is where, for me, it would be frightening when I think about the repercussions on a spiritual level on the Day of Judgment, because if I'm using that or withholding an Islamic divorce as a form of punishment or as a form of oppression, I would be incredibly fearful about what is going to happen when I die. But not only that, it's going to be considered as a form of coercive and controlling behaviour, is that you denied giving me a religious divorce, and that religious divorce can be so important in terms of my identity, my standing, my children's participation in family activities, cultural activities, religious activities. How is that not a form of coercive and controlling behaviour and violence? For me, it is. Yeah. It's clear as day.
Oh, and that's why we have a whole episode in this podcast dedicated to that whole topic, because women and men in the community are calling for change.
Yes.
Right? And there are structures that could change. And inshallah, we hope soon it will. There's been a lot of research done in that field, which has looked at the experiences of Muslim women going through divorce.
And that research you're talking about, alhamdulillah, primarily driven by Muslim women.
Yeah.
And so I think that is also incredibly important. Incredibly important. Just like I don't know what it's like to grow up as a woman of colour, right? Absolutely don't. It's incredibly important that the people who are speaking about that issue or the people that are writing about that issue are women of colour, for example. So I think it's fantastic. And the women that are presenting research in this field are highly regarded outside the Muslim community as well. And so that's something for me is very exciting, because if we continue to invest in the youth and invest in women's agency in terms of having the capacity to tell their stories, even if it makes us feel vulnerable, we can only grow as a whole, as a community. And that is something that I think once we realise that it's okay to be vulnerable and that there is strength in telling our stories, or there's strength in telling my personal story to my lawyer or to my psychologist or to my support service that I've been referred to, there is strength in that, and that it's going to help you. I think once we get our minds around that, we'll all be better off.
And I think that is an amazing note to end on and conclude on, because, you know, it's a whole of community solution. It is about owning your story and then not taking on more than you need to.
Absolutely.
You know, and we've just touched on so many important discussions, and I think we could go on for hours. But thank you so much, Lydia, for really just bringing these to light and talking about the things that are very, very difficult, right? And personally affecting people in their most, you know, what the spaces that are supposed to be the most safe and most protected.
Yeah.
And, you know, the work that you're doing in this field is amazing, and whatever support you need, we are there as MWA to support you as being an advocate for women in this space. So thank you so much for having the discussion with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. But can I say that the MWA were very early on very keen supporters of my advocacy, and I think that the programs and this program, as well as many others that you are doing now but you have done in the past, I'm going to start crying, I've seen it cause a tremendous amount of change within individuals' lives and communities' lives. So thank you, and may God protect everybody that works on such beneficial programs. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.